Bring that tray to the blue room. Now, the girls are waiting. I think you've got the wrong person. You're in black, standing by the bar holding a tray I just handed you. What part of that is confusing? The part where I'm a guest. A guest who just stood here and let me load a tray into her hands without saying a word until now?
Look, I don't have time to figure out which agency sent you tonight. My friends are thirsty, the room is full, and you're the only person near this bar not currently holding a drink, so...
So nothing. Excuse me? You heard me.
I don't work for you?
I came with Hana. She's somewhere in this apartment right now, probably wondering where I disappeared to.
Soo-yeon's mouth opened to argue further, but a few of her friends had drifted closer, drawn by the tension the way people are always drawn to a scene about to happen. One girl in black lifted her phone halfway, not filming exactly, just ready in case something worth filming occurred. So-yeon's cheeks went pink, the kind of pink that comes from being embarrassed in front of an audience, rather than actually believing she was wrong. "Don't stand there acting innocent," she snapped, voice climbing, even though Imani hadn't raised hers at all. "You walked into my home in a server's outfit, and you're surprised I assumed something. That's not on me. It's not a server's outfit. It's a dress. It's black. So is half the room." That got a small snort from somewhere behind Soo-yeon, quickly swallowed. The tension in the room had the texture of something about to snap, and that was exactly when the front doors opened and the entire apartment seemed to inhale at once. Conversation didn't stop. It just thinned out, dropped down to a hush, the kind that happens automatically in certain rooms when certain people walk into them. Imani turned along with everyone else and saw him before she fully understood who she was looking at. Tall, dark suit with no tie, jaw sharp enough that it looked deliberate, like someone had drawn him with a ruler and then decided softness wasn't necessary. His eyes moved across the room once, landed on his sister, and then landed on Imani, and something in his face caught, like a record skipping. Soo-yeon spun toward him immediately, posture straightening on instinct. "Oppa. Perfect timing. Can you believe this? I asked her to help with drinks and she's been arguing with me for 5 straight minutes like she's not even staff." He didn't answer his sister right away. He was still looking at Imani, brow furrowed slightly, like he was trying to solve something in his head before speaking out loud. "Imani." His voice landed quiet, almost disbelieving. Soo-yeon blinked. "Wait, you two know each other?" Before he could answer, a voice cut across the room from the hallway, warm and a little breathless. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere. Did you get lost trying to find the bathroom again?" Hana came around the corner in a deep blue dress, caught sight of the scene, and immediately read the room with the accuracy of someone who'd known Imani for 15 years. "Oh no. What happened?" "Soo-yeon, please tell me you didn't." Soo-yeon's expression cracked slightly. She was standing by the bar. "She's a doctor, Soo-yeon. She works at Seoul General. She is not your waitress." The girl in black lowered her phone slowly, suddenly very interested in the floor. Ye Jun-oh crossed the room in a handful of steps, ignoring his sister's mortification entirely, and stopped a respectful distance from Imani, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to stand any closer. "I've been looking for you for 2 years." His voice dropped. "Quiet now, just for her. Min-jun has wanted to thank you properly since the day he woke up. I never even got your last name before you disappeared on us." Imani studied his face, the urgency in it, the disbelief that she was actually standing in front of him. "You're the friend." It came out slow, the memory surfacing, the one who wouldn't leave the waiting room. "They had to physically remove me at one point." A small, surprised laugh broke out of her, despite everything that had just happened. "I remember that. The nurses called you the wall, because you wouldn't move from outside the door. In my defense, nobody would tell me anything. You weren't family. I told them I was his brother. You don't look anything alike. I was very convincing." Soo-yeon, still pink in the face, looked between her brother and the woman she'd just tried to put to work serving champagne. Okay, in my defense, how was I supposed to know? She didn't even correct me with an accent. She just stood there being very calm about it, which honestly made it worse. Calm is generally how people respond when they're telling the truth, Hana said, not bothering to hide her amusement now. I'm aware of that now. Thank you. Yejun finally turned his attention to his sister, one eyebrow raised in a way that told her this conversation was not finished, not by a long shot. We'll talk later. Suyeon visibly deflated. Already mentally drafting an apology she suspected would need several drafts before it satisfied him. Before we go any further, hi bestie, welcome back to AfroSeoul Desires. Do well to subscribe, like, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Now let's rewind 2 years, back to the night none of them have ever fully talked about since. The emergency room at Seoul General had been running on fumes that night, short 2 nurses, and 1 resident who'd called in sick at the worst possible hour. Imani Carter had been on her feet for 11 hours straight when the doors burst open and 4 men came through carrying a 5th between them, blood soaking through his shirt at the shoulder and his side, his face the color of paper. He needs the best room you have, right now. No questions. No paperwork yet. The man barking orders had his hand clamped on a nurse's elbow, hard enough that she winced, and Imani came around the corner already moving before she'd even fully processed the scene. The rest of the ward had gone strangely still around the edges of the chaos, the way it always did when something serious rolled through the doors. Other patients craning to see, a junior nurse frozen mid-step, with a tray of supplies forgotten in her hands. Imani didn't have time for any of that. She had time for the wound, the pulse under her fingers, the narrowing window before stable became something much worse. Let go of her arm, Imani said, and something in her tone made him actually do it. She crouched beside the gurney, 2 fingers at the wounded man's throat, eyes already cataloging the damage. Get me a trauma bay. Get me O negative on standby. Somebody page surgery now. You don't understand who he is. One of the men started. I understand he's losing blood faster than you're explaining yourself. So either help me move him or get out of my way. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. There was something in the flatness of it that cut through the noise, better than shouting ever could. Min-jun, half-conscious, gripped weakly at the edge of the gurney as they wheeled him through the doors, his eyes finding Imani's face for just a second before the lights blurred together. He would tell people later that he didn't remember much of that night, the pain and the morphine smoothing everything into a soft gray fog, but he remembered her voice. Steady, sure, completely unbothered by the 4 armed men crowding her hallway. Yejun arrived 20 minutes later, having sprinted 3 red lights and abandoned his car halfway up the curb. He found his security detail standing useless outside a set of double doors, and a woman's voice coming from inside, low and controlled, talking someone through a procedure he didn't have the vocabulary to understand. He stood there for almost 4 hours. Nobody could make him sit down. When the doors finally opened, she came out, pulling off bloodied gloves, exhaustion written into every line of her face, and looked at the room full of men waiting on her verdict like she'd just remembered they existed. He's stable. The next 12 hours matter. But he's stable. Can I see him? Not yet. Sit down. You look like you're about to become my next patient. He didn't sit down, but he did stop pacing, which for him at the time counted as a significant concession. Thank you. He meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in years. Thank the surgical team. I just bought him time to get to them. What's your name? Dr. Carter. I'm off shift in 10 minutes, and I'd very much like to be unconscious somewhere within the hour. So if that's everything. It wasn't everything, not even close, but she was already walking away before he could say anything more. white coat trailing behind her, like she had somewhere far more important to be than standing in a hallway, accepting gratitude from a stranger. He came back 2 days later when Minjun was finally lucid enough to ask for visitors, and Imani happened to be the one to walk him through discharge instructions. Minjun, propped up in bed, color slowly returning to his face, looked at her like he was trying to place something. "You're the one who yelled at my security. I corrected your security. They said you told one of them to argue in the hallway. He was being unreasonable, in a room where I needed quiet." A real laugh this time. Weak but genuine. "I like her," Minjun said to Yejun, who was standing near the window pretending he hadn't been watching Imani's hands the entire time. She adjusted the IV line, gentle and precise. The way she touched Minjun's wrist like it mattered. "Most people do. Right up until I tell them something they don't want to hear," Imani said, signing off on the chart. Yejun didn't say much that day. He didn't need to. He just watched her work, the patience in her, the way she never once flinched at the bruises, or the stitches, or the men in dark suits hovering by the door. He'd grown up around people who performed kindness when it was useful, and dropped it the moment it wasn't. She wasn't performing anything. She simply was what she was, all the way through, and something about that settled into him and refused to leave. He came back the following week to properly thank her, only to be told at the front desk that Dr. Carter had transferred. "International program," they said. "No forwarding details available outside of family." He came back the week after that anyway, and the week after that, telling himself it was about the debt he owed her. A life saved deserved more than a 5-minute conversation in a hallway. He had people who could find almost anyone in Seoul within a day. It took them 2 years to find nothing at all, because she'd been moving through field hospitals and disaster relief postings in places his usual channels simply didn't reach. Eventually he stopped looking, or told himself he had. The not knowing stayed lodged in him anyway, small and persistent, the kind of thing that surfaces at odd hours when a room goes quiet. What none of them knew, not even Minjun in his hospital bed, was that the woman who'd saved his life had once loved him. 3 years before the gunshot wound, Imani and Minjun had dated for almost a year. She was still finishing her residency in the States, and he was visiting Seoul University on an exchange program neither of them remembered to take seriously once they met each other. It had been easy and warm and entirely doomed by geography. He went home to Seoul. She stayed for her fellowship, and the distance did what distance always does. Slowly, and then all at once. They hadn't spoken in years by the time he landed on her trauma table, bleeding and unrecognizable under all the equipment. His name nothing more than a chart entry. She didn't have time to connect to a memory until much later, lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and thinking, that face, that voice asking for someone to call his sister. It can't be. It was. She never told him at the hospital. There hadn't been room for it, not with his life hanging on the next several hours, and by the time there might have been room, she'd already accepted the transfer overseas, partly to outrun the strange grief of almost losing someone she used to love without ever getting the chance to say so. Back in the present, 3 weeks after the ball, Minjun finally got his proper introduction, walking into a quiet restaurant Yejun had booked entirely under someone else's name to avoid attention, only to stop dead in the doorway when he saw who was sitting at the table. No. The word came out flat, frozen in the doorway. Minjun. No. Absolutely not. This is not happening. You cannot be the doctor. I can, in fact, be the doctor. He sat down slowly, like his legs had made the decision without consulting the rest of him. You saved my life, and didn't tell me you were you. You were unconscious for most of it. There wasn't exactly a window. There was a window. You signed my discharge papers. You stood in my hospital room for an hour. I was being professional. You were being a coward. There was no real heat in it, just astonishment chasing itself around in circles. He turned to Yejun, who had gone very still in the way he always did when he was bracing for something. Did you know? Know what? That she's Imani. My Imani. The one I told you about 100 times in college. The one who taught me how to make dumplings because I burned the first batch so badly the smoke with alarm went off twice. Yejun's expression flickered, something working itself out behind his eyes. I didn't know that part. You're sure? I would have told you the second I found out, you know that. Minjun sat with that for a long moment, looking between the two of them. Something shifting and resettling in his face. Well, he finally said, dragging a hand down his face. This is either the best dinner of my life or the worst one. I genuinely don't know yet. It turned out to be neither. Not exactly. It turned into something stranger, the three of them laughing over old stories, until well past midnight. Minjun recounting the dumpling disaster in exaggerated detail, while Imani argued every embellishment, Yejun watching the two of them with an expression he hadn't let himself examine too closely yet. That expression became impossible to ignore over the following months, as Yejun found more and more reasons to see Imani that had nothing to do with gratitude. Coffee after her shifts, ostensibly about a hospital wing his family's foundation was funding, a community health drive, where he stood beside her for 3 hours, handing out flyers like a man with absolutely nowhere more important to be. Conversations that ran long past their natural ending point, because neither of them wanted to be the one to call it. Their first real date, the kind that involved an actual reservation rather than a coincidental overlap of schedules, happened at a small restaurant Yejun had chosen, specifically because nobody there would recognize his name on sight. He'd worn a plain jacket instead of his usual tailored suits, and when Imani pointed that out, amused, he admitted he'd spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what a normal person wore to dinner. You do realize you're still the most overdressed person at this entire restaurant. I tried. This was the result of trying. It's a good result. I'm just saying the bar for normal might be somewhere you've never personally visited. He laughed at that, easy and unguarded, in a way she hadn't seen from him before. All the careful posture of boardrooms and family dinners momentarily set aside. They talked for nearly 3 hours, about nothing important and everything that mattered, and by the time the staff began politely hovering near their table, Imani realized she'd forgotten entirely to check the time, even once, a small miracle for someone whose entire profession ran on the clock. His assistant, a perpetually unimpressed man named Daniel, who'd worked for the family since Yejun was 22, noticed before anyone said a word about it. You've canceled 4 board calls this month for, and I'm reading directly from your calendar here, hospital outreach, Daniel said one afternoon, not looking up from his tablet. It's important work. It's the 3rd hospital outreach this week. There are a lot of hospitals. There are not, in fact, that many hospitals. Yejun said nothing, which Daniel correctly took as confirmation of everything he already suspected. Imani's side of the story had its own running commentary, courtesy of Grace Mensa, a fellow attending in the ER who had appointed herself unofficial relationship analyst the moment she clocked Imani, checking her phone between patients with a small, private smile she clearly didn't know she was wearing. "You're doing the thing again," Grace said, not looking up from the chart she was filling out. "What thing?" "The smiling at nothing thing. You did it twice during rounds, and once while restocking gauze, which, frankly, gauze has never made anyone smile in the history of medicine. I have no idea what you're talking about." "Uh-huh. And I suppose the security car that picks you up after every double shift. Now, the one with the driver who insists on calling you Dr. Carter like you're visiting royalty, that's also nothing. That's just a friend being considerate." "A friend," Grace finally looked up, eyebrows raised so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. Imani, I have met your friends. None of them own a car with bulletproof glass. You don't know that it's bulletproof. I tapped on it. It sounded expensive, and also bulletproof. Those are two very specific sounds, and I know both of them. Imani laughed despite herself, the kind of laugh that gave away more than she meant to. Fine. There might be someone. It's new. I'm not sure what it is yet. Well, whatever it is. Tell new mystery man I said he has excellent taste, and also that if he breaks your heart I will find him, because I went to medical school specifically to learn where all the bones are. That is a deeply unsettling thing to say to a friend. I'm a deeply unsettling friend when it counts. The months that followed carried that same easy rhythm. Dinners that ran long, conversations that wandered into territory neither of them had planned to share so soon. Yejun told her, slowly, about a childhood spent feeling more like an extension of the family name than an actual person, about a mother whose love had always arrived wrapped tightly in expectation. Imani told him about field hospitals, about a particular night in a relief camp that still visited her in dreams sometimes, about the strange quiet of coming home to a city that had kept moving without her. He never pushed for details about parts of his life he wasn't ready to open yet, and she never pushed back when he changed the subject too quickly. There was a kind of trust building underneath all of it, patient and unhurried, the sort that doesn't announce itself with anything dramatic, just shows up one day fully formed, because neither of them noticed it arriving. When Minjun found out, it wasn't through a calm conversation over dinner. It was through a photograph, grainy and taken from across the street, of Yejun and Imani standing close together outside a cafe, his hand resting briefly against the small of her back as they crossed the street. A friend forwarded it to him with a casual caption, "Isn't this your buddy's hospital crush?" And Minjun stared at the image for a long time before calling Yejun directly. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Yejun, to his credit, didn't lie. "I've been seeing her for about 2 months." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Yejun checked to see if the call had dropped. "You knew how I felt about her," Minjun finally said, voice tight. "I told you everything about her in college, every single detail. And you sat across from me at dinner 3 weeks ago, knowing exactly who she was to me, and said nothing. It wasn't planned. That makes it worse. Somehow, you didn't even have to scheme for it. It just happened, while I was standing right there being grateful she saved my life." Minjun, just don't, for a second. There was a long pause, the sound of him exhaling hard on the other end. "I need some time. I'm not saying never. I'm saying I need time to not want to put my fist through something every time I think about this." He kept his distance for almost 2 months, declining invitations, letting calls go to voicemail, the kind of silence that says more than any argument could. Imani felt the weight of it too, guilt sitting heavy in her chest, even though she knew, logically, that loving someone wasn't a betrayal of a relationship that had ended years before any of this started. "You didn't do anything wrong," Hana told her over dinner one night, watching Imani push rice around her plate without actually eating any of it. "You can't owe loyalty to a relationship that ended before half this story even started. It still feels like I took something from him." "You didn't take anything. Things happened in an order nobody planned. That's different from stealing." It was Minjun himself who eventually closed the distance, showing up unannounced at Yejun's office on a Tuesday afternoon, dropping into the chair across from his desk, like he hadn't just spent 2 months avoiding the building entirely. "I'm still annoyed," he announced. "Understood. But I watched the way you used to talk about her, before you even knew it was her. The hospital visits that weren't really about the foundation. I'm not stupid, I just needed time to stop being angry long enough to admit I noticed. I'm sorry. I should have told you the second I realized who she was. You should have. But I also know you. And I know you would have stepped back from her completely if I'd asked you to. And I don't actually want that. I just needed to say, it hurt. Out loud, to your face, before I could let it go. He leaned back, something easing in his shoulders. She makes you different, lighter. I haven't seen you laugh like that since we were 23. You're really all right with this. I'm getting there. Ask me again in a month, and I might even mean it completely. A faint grin tugged at his mouth. Besides, I've been seeing someone myself. A violinist I met at a fundraiser, so it's not like my heart is sitting in pieces on the floor. Mostly I was just mad nobody told me. For what it's worth, I never wanted you to find out from a photograph. I know. That part actually stung more than the relationship itself. If I'm honest. Finding out from a stranger's caption, instead of from either of you. He shrugged, some of the old ease creeping back into his posture. But I've had 2 months to sit with it, and I keep landing in the same place. You two make sense in a way I don't think either of you have made sense with anyone else, including, historically, with me. I'd rather be the friend who's a little bruised and still standing close, than the one who walked away out of pride. That's a generous way to look at it. I contain multitudes, Minjun said, standing and stretching like the conversation had physically cost him something. Also, I'm hungry, and I happen to know a place that does dumplings correctly this time. So let's go. Both of you, my treat. Consider it the first installment of you owing me for being remarkably mature about all of this. Ye-jun actually laughed at that. Real and unguarded, the sound of attention finally breaking loose from his chest. Lead the way. The reconciliation with Minjun turned out to be the easy part. The O family was an entirely different matter. Madame O received Imani for the first time in the same sitting room where 3 generations of family decisions had quietly been made, the kind of room designed to make visitors feel the weight of history pressing down on them before a single word got spoken. She was gracious in the practiced way of someone who'd spent decades perfecting hospitality as a form of control. Dr. Carter. She took Imani's hand briefly. Ye-jun speaks of you constantly. I'm told you're quite accomplished. I try to be useful. Madame O repeated, like she was deciding whether the word satisfied her. An interesting way for a woman to describe herself. Seated nearby, an older woman in deep gray silk watched the exchange with sharp, assessing eyes. This was Madame Cho, Ye-jun's aunt on his father's side, who had spent the better part of a decade cultivating a particular vision for her nephew's future, one that involved a specific family, a specific bloodline, and absolutely no room for a foreign doctor with no inherited name behind her. Tell me, Madame Cho said during the second course, voice pleasant, in a way that didn't reach her eyes. How does a woman in your line of work imagine managing the demands of a family like ours, alongside something as unpredictable as emergency medicine? I've managed unpredictable circumstances before. I don't expect this to be different in kind, only in the specifics. The specifics matter a great deal, though. This family carries obligations that extend well past attending dinners and smiling for the right photographs. I understand that, Imani said evenly. I'd ask the same question of anyone stepping into something unfamiliar. But understanding a family's responsibilities and being born into them aren't the same thing. People learn things every day that they weren't raised to know. Madame Cho's smile thinned at the edges. Some things require having grown up inside them to fully grasp. Then I suppose I'll bring fresh eyes to it, where someone too comfortable might miss what actually needs attention. A young woman seated near the end of the table, introduced earlier as a family friend named Yuna, leaned forward with the bright, brittle enthusiasm of someone who'd clearly been coached on exactly when to speak up. It's just that this family has a certain rhythm to it, she offered. Things that aren't written down anywhere, but everyone simply knows. Which seat to take at which event, which topics to avoid with which relatives, that sort of thing. It takes years to absorb naturally. I work in an emergency room, Imani said. I learn unwritten rules at the speed of someone's life depending on it. I think I can manage seating arrangements. Soo-yeon, seated across the table, made a sound suspiciously like a cough that was actually a laugh she was trying very hard to suppress. Madame Cho shot her a look sharp enough to cut glass, and Soo-yeon immediately found her water glass fascinating. You'll forgive us for being cautious, Madame Cho continued, smoother now, recalibrating her approach. This family has been burned before by people who saw an opportunity rather than a genuine connection. I'm sure you understand why that history makes us careful. I understand caution. I don't understand being treated like a suspect before I've done anything to earn that suspicion. Nobody is treating you like a suspect, Dr. Carter. We are simply asking questions any reasonable family would ask. Then ask them directly, instead of through implications about seating charts and unwritten rules. I'd rather answer something honestly than guess at what you're actually trying to find out. The table went quiet for a beat. Madame O's expression remained carefully neutral, but something in her eyes shifted, the faintest flicker of reassessment. Who had been silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke, voice even but unmistakably firm. I think that's a fair request, actually. If there are real concerns, let's hear them plainly, instead of circling them all evening. Madame Cho's smile didn't waver, but her grip on her own water glass tightened almost imperceptibly. There's nothing more to say tonight. I was simply making conversation. Then let's make different conversation, Ye-jun said, and steered the table toward safer ground, though the undercurrent of the evening had already made itself clear to everyone present. Across the table, Soo-yeon, who had been mortified into excessive politeness ever since the ball incident, pressed her napkin to her mouth to hide a smile. Ye-jun said nothing, but something in his posture had eased, quiet approval settling into the line of his shoulders as he watched Imani hold her ground without raising her voice once. After Imani left for the evening, Madame Cho found her sister in the study, expression no longer wearing any pretense of warmth. You cannot seriously be entertaining this. A doctor with no family connections, no understanding of what this name requires. I've spent years preparing the Han family's daughter for exactly this role, and you're going to let him throw that away over an infatuation. He hasn't asked my permission to fall in love, sister. He doesn't need permission to fall in love. He needs permission to marry, and that permission belongs to this family's legacy, not to his momentary feelings. Madame O studied her sister for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her expression. I haven't decided anything yet. I'm simply watching. Watch faster. Before this goes somewhere none of us can undo. The weeks that followed brought a slow campaign of small cruelties, each one designed to look accidental. Invitations to family events that mysteriously failed to reach Imani. Comments dropped casually at dinners about women who married into families they didn't understand and lived to regret it. Madame Cho was careful never to attack directly where Ye-jun could hear it clearly, preferring instead the kind of pressure that worked itself into a mother's ear, slow and patient, like water finding cracks in stone. It came to a head 3 months later, at a family gathering meant to celebrate the unveiling of a renovated wing in the family's ancestral home. A jade pendant, passed down through 5 generations of O women and kept on display in a locked case in the main hall, went missing sometime during the evening, discovered gone only after the guests had begun to leave. I saw her near the case earlier, Madame Cho said, loud enough to carry across the room, The moment security confirmed the pendant was gone. She was standing right there, alone, for several minutes. I remember thinking it was strange. The accusation spread through the room like smoke, quiet at first, and then everywhere at once. Imani felt the weight of every eye turning toward her, the sudden careful distance people kept, like guilt might be contagious if they stood too close. I was looking at the case because it's beautiful, Imani said. Steady, despite the heat climbing up her neck. I didn't touch it. Nobody is accusing you of anything, Madame Cho said, in a tone that accused her of everything. I'm simply stating what I observed. Madame O's face had gone carefully blank. The particular blankness of someone trying very hard not to decide anything in the heat of the moment. We'll review the security footage. Until then, no accusations stand. The footage, frustratingly, showed a gap. The camera covering that section of the hall had malfunctioned for exactly the window of time in question, a coincidence that made Yejun's jaw tighten the moment he heard it. That camera has never malfunctioned in 4 years. His jaw stayed tight. Not once. Cameras fail, Madame Cho said smoothly. It happens. Gossip outlets, always hungry for anything involving the O family name, picked up a version of the story within days, vague enough to avoid legal trouble, but pointed enough that everyone understood exactly who they meant. A headline ran under a blurry photo of Imani leaving the hospital, the kind of photo that made an ordinary woman walking to her car look like she was fleeing a crime scene. The caption asked, in the breezy, deniable language gossip sites had perfected, whether the doctor dating into the O family was quite as spotless as she appeared. Imani's hospital colleagues grew quietly uneasy around her, whispers trailing her down hallways. She used to walk without a second thought. A scheduling coordinator who'd always greeted her warmly began finding reasons to avoid eye contact. Patients' families, the ones who recognized her face from the articles, looked at her with a flicker of something new in their expressions. Not quite suspicion, but its nervous cousin, the kind of doubt that arrives uninvited and refuses to leave once it's settled in. The pressure found its way to her directly within the week, in the form of a summons to the hospital's administrative office. Dr. Huang, the chief of medicine, a tired-looking man who had clearly been hoping to avoid this conversation entirely, gestured for her to sit without quite meeting her eyes. I want to be clear that this isn't a formal inquiry. He folded his hands on the desk, like that might soften what was coming next. But the board has received calls. Concerned donors, a few patients requesting a different attending physician. I'm not accusing you of anything, Dr. Carter. I genuinely am not. But optics matter to this institution, and right now the optics are not in your favor. I haven't been charged with anything. I haven't even been formally questioned by anyone outside that family. I understand that. I do. But until this resolves itself, I need you to understand that your position here isn't entirely insulated from outside noise, regardless of how unfair that feels. Are you suspending me? Not yet. The word sat between them, heavy with everything it implied. I would strongly suggest you find a way to resolve this quickly, for your own sake, as much as the hospital's. She left his office with her hands shaking, the particular kind of fury that has nowhere immediate to go, no target close enough to confront, nothing to do but absorb it and keep walking. Grace found her 20 minutes later staring blankly at a chart she clearly hadn't read a single word of. Huang called you in. How did you already know that? Because hospitals are basically very expensive high schools, and gossip moves through them at the speed of light. He's worried about donors, I heard. Grace dropped into the chair beside her, voice dropping out of its usual joking register entirely. For what it's worth, nobody on this floor believes a single word of it. I've worked beside you for 6 years. I've seen you walk past unlocked supply cabinets stuffed with controlled substances without so much as glancing at them. You don't steal so much as a pen from the nurse's station. It doesn't matter what's true if enough people decide to believe what isn't. It matters to the people who actually know you, and it'll matter to everyone else eventually. Because lies are exhausting to maintain, and the truth just has to sit there, existing. That night, lying awake long after she should have been asleep, Imani found herself doing the math on what she stood to lose if this didn't resolve in her favor. A license she'd spent a decade earning, a reputation built one careful shift at a time, a sense of herself as someone whose word meant something. She thought about calling Ye-jun and decided against it, not out of any doubt in him, but because she needed, just for one night, to know she could carry the weight of it without leaning on someone else to hold it for her. Ye-jun, for his part, was carrying a different kind of weight entirely. He found his aunt in the conservatory 2 days after the accusation first surfaced, standing among the orchids she'd always preferred to actual people, and didn't bother with any preamble. I want to know exactly what you saw that night. No preamble, no softening. Not the version you gave the room, the actual sequence of events, in order, before I decide how much further to take this. Madame Cho didn't turn around immediately, taking her time straightening a stem that didn't need straightening. I saw what I saw. A woman standing alone, near a display case that has since gone missing its contents. I don't know what further detail you're hoping I'll invent for you. I'm not asking you to invent anything. I'm asking you to be honest, for possibly the first time in this entire ordeal. That got her to turn around, eyes flashing with something close to genuine offense. You're accusing your own aunt of fabricating a theft. I'm asking pointed questions because the camera covering that exact section of hallway happened to fail for exactly the 9 minutes in question, and I find that an extraordinarily convenient coincidence for someone who has made her opinion of Imani known at every possible opportunity since the day they met. Cameras fail. I am not responsible for the competence of whoever maintains this house's security systems. Daniel has maintained this house's security systems for 11 years without a single failure of that kind, and you know that as well as I do. His voice stayed level, but there was a coldness underneath it now that made the temperature in the room feel like it had dropped several degrees. I am telling you plainly, while I still have the patience to tell you plainly, instead of simply acting on what I already suspect, that if I find out you had any hand in this, the consequences will not be limited to a stern conversation in a conservatory. You would threaten your own family over her. I would protect an innocent woman from a campaign of cruelty, dressed up as concern, regardless of who's running it. He held her gaze a moment longer, then turned to leave, seeing only once at the doorway. I hope, for everyone's sake, that I'm wrong about you. I genuinely do. But I don't think I am. Madame Cho said nothing as he left, her hands gone very still among the orchids, the first flicker of real fear crossing her face since the accusation had first left her mouth. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Imani admitted to Hana one night, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. I told myself I could handle whatever his world threw at me, but I didn't think it would mean my name attached to a theft I didn't commit, splashed across gossip sites for strangers to argue about, my own hospital questioning whether I could keep my job over it. You didn't do this. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone's louder about the lie. Truth is slow, though. Lies move faster. And right now, I'm the one paying interest on someone else's debt. It was Daniel, of all people, who finally cracked the case open, less out of loyalty to Imani and more out of stubborn professional pride that a security system under his oversight had supposedly failed without explanation. Cameras do not simply malfunction for 9 minutes and then resume working perfectly with no error log whatsoever. he told Ye-jun, scrolling through diagnostic reports with the focused irritation of a man who took equipment failures personally. Either someone is lying to me about a system I personally installed, or someone tampered with it, and I do not appreciate either possibility. Can you prove which one it was? Give me 2 days and a very large pot of coffee. It took him slightly less than 2 days, though the coffee consumption was, by his own later admission, fairly close to heroic. He pulled archived backup footage from a secondary system installed years earlier as a redundancy measure, one that nobody outside of Daniel's own department even remembered existed. Tucked away on a server that had never been mentioned in any briefing Madame Cho would have had access to. Mrs. Pak, the estate's longtime house manager, a woman who noticed everything and said very little about most of it, found Daniel in the security office well past midnight and set down a tray with tea he hadn't asked for, but drank gratefully anyway. You look like a man who hasn't slept. I haven't. Something doesn't sit right about that footage gap, and I intend to find out what, before this family tears itself apart over it. Whatever you find, Mrs. Pak said quietly, I would start by asking who in this house owed money to people who don't accept late payments gracefully. I've worked here 18 years. I notice things. A certain young man hasn't seemed himself in months. Daniel looked up sharply. Which young man? Mrs. Pak only offered a small, knowing nod toward the hallway that led to the family's private wing before excusing herself, leaving him with considerably more direction than he'd had an hour earlier. Found something, he told Ye-jun the following morning, sliding his laptop across the desk, without further preamble. You're not going to like it. The footage showed a young man, nervous, glancing over his shoulder twice, before slipping the display case open with a key he clearly wasn't supposed to have, pocketing the pendant, and disappearing down a side hallway within 90 seconds. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Run facial recognition, Ye-jun said, voice flat. Already did, while the coffee was brewing. Daniel hesitated, an unusual pause for a man who rarely hesitated about anything. It's her son. Ye-jun sat back slowly, the pieces sliding into place with a kind of sick clarity. She accused an innocent woman of theft, in front of half the family, to protect her own son's mistake. She stood in that conservatory 2 days ago and let me apologize for even suspecting her. It would appear so. I'd recommend confirming the rest before anyone says a word, but the footage is fairly conclusive. It took another quiet day of careful confirmation, Daniel cross-referencing pawn shop records and bank transfers with the patient thoroughness of a man who clearly should have gone into forensic accounting instead of corporate security before the full picture assembled itself. Madame Cho's son, drowning in gambling debts he'd kept hidden from his mother for over a year, had taken the pendant as a quiet, desperate solution, intending to pawn it before anyone noticed it was missing, only for the unveiling event to move up its schedule and catch him unprepared. When Ye-jun brought the footage to his mother, she watched it twice in complete silence, her face draining of color somewhere around the second viewing. When she finally spoke, her voice had none of its usual measured calm. You let her name be dragged through every gossip column in this city, she told her sister, summoning her into the same room without warning so she could watch the footage land in real time. To protect your son's mistake, and then you stood in my hall and pointed your finger at an innocent woman to finish the job. I was protecting this family. You were protecting yourself from the embarrassment of admitting your own son's failures. That is not the same thing, and I will not let you pretend otherwise. Madame O's hands trembled slightly, fury and grief tangled together. I have spent years listening to you tell me who deserves a place in this family and who doesn't. I see now exactly how much of that judgment was never about protecting us at all. The fallout was swift. Madame Cho's standing within the family, once unquestioned, collapsed under the weight of what she'd done, the lie and the cover-up both. Her son's debts were quietly settled, the pendant returned to its case, and a correction, brief but unmistakable, ran across the same gossip sites that had carried the original accusation. Dr. Huang called Imani back into his office the following week, considerably more apologetic this time, and made a point of stating, on record, that her position at the hospital had never actually been in question, a claim everyone in the room understood to be more generous to him than to the truth. Madame O requested a private meeting with Imani, not long after, the two of them alone in the same study where Madame Cho had once made her case. Against the relationship altogether. I judged you before I understood anything about who you actually are, Madame O said. No performance left in her voice at all. I let my sister's fears become my own without question, and I let that nearly cost my son the person who makes him most himself. You were protecting your family. I understand that instinct. Protecting and punishing an innocent person aren't the same thing, and I confused the two for far too long. Her hands folded carefully in her lap. You saved my son's best friend before you knew either of their names. You stayed through every ugly thing this family put in your path, not because you'd accepted any of it, but because you trusted my son underneath all of it. That kind of loyalty cannot be arranged or inherited. It has to be real. It is real. Madame O reached out and took Imani's hands in both of hers, something entirely different from the careful graciousness of their first meeting. Then you have my blessing, fully, without reservation, and my apology, which I know arrives far too late to undo any of the damage. Late is still better than never. That night, Imani called her friend Yara back home, propping her phone against a stack of textbooks while she finally caught up on sleep-deprived laundry. Yara answered on the second ring, already mid-bite of something crunchy. Okay, catch me up. Last I heard you were about to be publicly accused of stealing a family heirloom from a billionaire's mansion, which, frankly, is the most interesting thing that has ever happened to anyone I know personally. It got resolved. The aunt's son took it. To cover gambling debts. Yara nearly choked. I'm sorry. The aunt's son. The same aunt who tried to ruin your reputation in front of the entire Korean gossip industrial complex. That's the one. Imani. Imani, this is a soap opera. This is actual, literal soap opera content. Are you telling me you are living inside a Tuesday night drama and you didn't think to call me the moment it started? I was a little busy being accused of theft, Yara. Excuses. Excuses. There was a pause, the sound of a chair creaking as Yara settled in properly. Okay, but real talk. Are you okay? That's genuinely terrifying, having your name dragged through something like that. I'm okay, his mother apologized properly. The truth came out faster than I expected, honestly. And the boyfriend, he handled it right, defended you, didn't go wobbly under family pressure. He never once wavered, not for a second. Good. Because I will fly to Seoul on my own dime and have words with an entire conglomerate if I need to, you know that. I know that. I genuinely believe you would. I absolutely would. I've seen what you went through to get your medical license, Imani Carter. Nobody, billionaire or otherwise, gets to put your name through the mud and walk away clean. The conversation wandered on for another hour, easy and warm, the kind of call that left Imani lighter than she'd felt in weeks, a reminder that whatever storm moved through the O family's world, there was a whole life of people outside of it who'd loved her long before any of this began and would keep loving her regardless of how it ended. Ye-jun proposed 6 weeks later, on an ordinary evening that held none of the spectacle people might have expected from a man with his resources. Just the two of them on the rooftop of the hospital where they'd first crossed paths. The city spread out below them in scattered light. I had an elaborate plan, he admitted, a small velvet box trembling slightly in his hand as he knelt. A whole evening arranged, and then I realized none of it mattered as much as just asking you honestly, the same way you've always asked things of me. Then ask. Marry me. Not because of anything my family needs, not to settle any debt, but because I genuinely cannot picture continuing this life without you somewhere in the middle of it. You found me standing useless in a hallway 2 years ago, and never once treated me like I was too important to be told the truth. I'd like to spend the rest of my life matching that. Yes. Laughter and sudden tears tangled together in the single word. Before he'd even fully finished the sentence. Obviously, yes. News of the engagement reached Sooyeon roughly 4 minutes after Imani said yes, which she would later insist was simply good instinct, and everyone else would insist was the result of her having half-convinced Daniel to text her. The moment anything happened on that rooftop, she showed up at Imani's apartment the following morning with a box of pastries, 2 bottles of sparkling cider, because she'd decided the occasion called for celebration, before lunchtime, and an expression that suggested she had already begun planning several things nobody had asked her to plan. I want to throw you an engagement dinner, she announced, before Imani had even fully opened the door. Small, tasteful. I have learned my lesson about assuming things about people in black dresses, so don't worry. Every guest will be properly identified at the entrance this time, possibly with name tags. I haven't fully decided. You really don't need name tags. I am traumatized, Imani. Let me have the name tags. The dinner happened 2 weeks later, smaller than Sooyeon's initial vision, but no less warm for it, held in a private room at the restaurant where Minjun had first reunited with Imani over dumplings. A detail Sooyeon had insisted on once she heard the story. Minjun arrived with Aryum on his arm, already mid-story about a rehearsal that had run long, and greeted Imani with a hug that lasted a beat longer than strictly necessary. I want it noted. He pulled back, grinning. That I called this, not the engagement specifically, but something. I told you both, weeks ago, that you made sense together in a way that worried me a little. Honestly, how fast it all clicked. You did not call this, Yejun said. You spent 2 months refusing my calls. I was processing. Processing is a form of calling it. I was simply calling it internally. Grace arrived not long after, immediately commandeering a chair beside Hannah and announcing, to absolutely nobody's surprise, that she fully intended to be invited to whatever came next, wedding included, and that she expected a +1 because she was bringing a date she hadn't technically asked yet, but was fairly confident would say yes. You haven't asked him yet. Details, Imani. Details. Even Yuna showed up, considerably more subdued than she'd been at that first family dinner, and found a quiet moment near the drinks table to speak with Imani directly, something close to genuine apology in her voice. I want you to know I wasn't trying to make things harder for you that night. I was simply repeating things I'd been told to say. And I'm not proud of that now that I've actually gotten to know you a little. You handled all of it with more grace than I think I would have. I appreciate you saying that. For what it's worth, I think you're exactly what this family needed, even if it took some of us a humiliatingly long time to notice it. Madame O arrived toward the end of the evening, briefly, just long enough to raise a glass and offer a toast that left more than one person in the room, reaching for a napkin they hadn't expected to need. Madame Cho did not attend, still working her way slowly back into the family's good graces through smaller, quieter gestures, though she sent flowers the following morning with a card that read, simply, and without further embellishment, congratulations, and Imani chose to take it as a beginning rather than judge it as insufficient. By the time the night wound down, Imani found herself standing near the window with a glass of cider she hadn't finished, watching the people who had somehow, over the course of a single chaotic year, become her family, in every sense that mattered beyond paperwork. Slipping an arm around her without a word, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, content simply to watch the room they'd built together, one difficult, hard-won relationship at a time. The wedding took place 4 months later, smaller than the family's usual standard, but warm in every way that counted. The ceremony itself was held in a quiet garden hall on the outskirts of the city, chosen specifically because it could hold 200 guests comfortably, rather than the 800 the family's usual venues demanded. A decision Madame O had supported without hesitation. Once Imani explained, she wanted to actually recognize the faces in the room, rather than lose them in a sea of unfamiliar ones. Soo-yeon, fully reformed from her ball disaster, cried through the entire ceremony and later admitted she'd hired 3 separate catering coordinators just to make absolutely certain nobody got aid. Mistaken for staff again, a level of overcorrection that made even Imani laugh out loud during the reception. "You really didn't need 3 coordinators," Imani told her, still grinning. "I needed at least 1. The other 2 were for my own peace of mind. I will never live down handing you that tray. And at this point I've accepted it's simply part of our story now. It is a pretty good story. It's a mortifying story that happens to have a good ending. There's a difference, and I live with that difference every single day." Minjun stood beside Yejun as his best man, raising a toast that managed to be both genuinely moving and a not-so-subtle reminder of the dumpling incident that started it all, complete with a brief, dramatic reenactment of the smoke alarm going off that had half the room in tears of laughter. He'd brought the violinist along as his date, a quiet, warm woman named Ariam, who fit into the group with an ease that suggested she'd been around far longer than the few months she actually had. "I want it on record," Minjun said, raising his glass, "that I was furious about this for exactly 2 months, which I think is a very reasonable amount of time, all things considered. And I want it on record that I have never seen my best friend this unguarded around another person in the 15 years I've known him. So, Imani, welcome to the family properly this time, without a hospital gown or a gunshot wound involved." Madame O sat in the front row, watching her son and his new wife with an expression that held nothing but pride. And beside her, even Madame Cho, humbled and quietly grateful for a second chance the family hadn't owed her, allowed herself a small, real smile, the first genuine one Imani had seen on her face since they'd met. Grace Mensah, seated near the back with a glass of champagne she'd already decided not to count, leaned over to Hana mid-ceremony and whispered, loud enough that several nearby guests heard and grinned, "I still maintain that car was bulletproof." "It absolutely was," Hana whispered back. "I knew it. I have never once been wrong about a bulletproof car." Later that night, after most of the guests had gone and the garden lights had dimmed to something softer, Imani found a quiet corner with Yejun, the 2 of them watching the last of the staff clear the tables in comfortable silence. "2 years ago, I handed you a tray and basically accused you of trespassing in my own apartment," Soo-yeon said, appearing beside them with 2 cups of tea she'd apparently decided everyone needed, whether they wanted it or not. "If you'd told me then that we'd end up here, I would have laughed you out of the building." "If you'd told me then," Imani said, "I would have asked which building, because I genuinely had no idea whose apartment I'd wandered into." The woman who had once been handed a serving tray she never asked to carry stood now at the center of the room, dressed not in black, but in white, beside the most powerful man in Seoul, who looked at her like she was the only thing in that room worth seeing at all, and who would spend every year after that one proving, in small quiet ways no headline would ever capture, that he meant it. Let me know in the comments whether you think Imani was right to give Yejun's world a chance after everything his family put her through. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, leave a like, and drop your favorite scene in the comments. And when you are ready for another unforgettable story, your next one is already waiting for you on the screen.